From the Mercy One studio.
Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner. Uh-oh. You there, bud?
Yeah.
All right. What's your name, sir, dear sir, talking to me on on our show?
Oh, Dr. Bud Marr. You just patched me in?
Yeah, I think you've spoken to the void there at first. So yes, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr.
Yes.
Coming to you from the various places across the map of these United States of America. I'm here in Des Moines, Iowa. I'm the Director of Mission and Ministry at Mercy College of Health Sciences and the Director of the Zeta Institute for Foundation and Ethics and Leadership. You can find us at mchs.edu and zetainstitute.com. Bud, you're out there in Pittsburgh. What are you heading up there in the old steel town?
So, directing the National Institute for Newman Studies. We're a research library here dedicated to the life and thought of John Henry Newman, and you can find us at newmanstudies.org.
I figured, Bud, that maybe you heard me, but we're tired, because just to reveal a little bit of the inner workings of how this show goes down, Bud and I had a very important event in our friendship yesterday. We had our annual draft for our fantasy football league, and that's always special when bros get together and talk about grown men making many more millions of dollars than they do. But it was fun. So I didn't know if maybe you were just still now recovering.
I am recovering. The league that we're a part of, they issue a grade when you're finished with your draft, and I was I earned a C+ for my draft. In an era of grade inflation, that made me feel pretty low.
Yeah, see, I got a defiant C-, and I can't wait to prove Yahoo wrong. So,
yeah,
that kind of sums up the attitudes of you and I on this show. You're sweating out the C+, and I'm like, good, I wish they gave me a D, so when I hoist that trophy, I can show all of those Yahoo people they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I need more of your attitude. I kind of walked to work today like Charlie Brown. Can we cue that music?
Yeah,
no, it's probably copyrighted.
That's right. We don't want
to
be paying the Schultz estate millions of dollars. That's a pretty good point.
Yeah.
We really need to. If we were half the Catholic radio program we said we should get sponsored by some fantasy football league. That would be absolutely hilarious.
Awesome. Yeah.
Who we are sponsored by is sort of the fantasy football league of health science colleges, Mercy College of Health Sciences, where if you get to draft first, Bud, you should draft Mercy first. See how I worked that in there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So they've actually just started their new semester. They had record-breaking new student enrollment, people running around. We had our first Mass of the year, new students to see. It's wonderful to have everybody on campus with us. You got your class started online, if I'm not mistaken. So mchs.edu. We have started the fall semester, probably a little late to start for fall, but there starts in spring and summer as well. And like I said, easy to check out what's going on, mchs.edu.
Yeah, I'm actually doing 2 classes this semester, so tackling the servant leadership, but also bioethics. And I always really liked bioethics. I think it's great that Mercy keeps that ethics course in the curriculum.
That's wonderful.
Really important.
Are you going to use your fantasy football victories and woes to make ethical points?
I just mostly rant about science fiction films that show the direction we're heading. No, we dive deep into the tradition and look at all sorts of philosophical principles for these questions. But there is a little sci-fi, so
a little bit of Bud and I have got to teach this course, and it's always funny when you know when you're starting to be an old man, when you're like, this is this wonderful movie that talks about the future of science, kids, and everyone's like, I was 5 when this came out. And you're like, you stop talking and just watch the movie.
Yeah, well, teaching, my cultural references are aging out quickly, so I need to just buckle down and purchase a Netflix subscription.
That's right. Watch some of what the hip kids are talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Make musical reference of as what's Post Malone would say. I don't know what he sings, but just say their names and they'll be pretty impressed. But
okay.
Yeah. Well, speaking of name dropping, I feel like we get a chance to do that with the person that we're going to interview today. But do you want to talk about him a bit, because you got the good fortune to set up who we're talking to today?
Well, it's kind of crazy how it worked out, because I'm hoping most of our listeners were able to take off Monday for Labor Day, which our country sets aside to kind of commemorate workers and to take a rest from our labors. Because our guest today has written a book precisely on that question. Our guest is Michael Naughton, and he's the director of the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. But he's recently published a book as part of Emmaus's Living Faith series, and it's called Getting Work Right, Labor and Leisure in a Fragmented World. So it's kind of great how it worked out, where I picked up conversations with Dr. Naughton, and he's able to come on and talk about this book right after Labor Day.
Yeah, it's a fantastic-looking book, and like you said, the sort of ways in which God sort of drops things into our laps. I'm pretty sure we wouldn't really have guests or a show if it wasn't for the Lord watching out for us. But it makes a lot of sense to talk about this. Labor Day, of course, in our mind, is mostly associated with the leisure that taking the day off for Labor Day sort of commences. I think the book's going to show how that's not necessarily completely wrong, right? It's we take the day off to appreciate labor, and you have to have leisure to do so, but maybe clouded in the cooking and the cookouts and the football. We start to need to think about what is work and what is leisure for when it comes to our relationship with God. So we're going to be listening. We're going to be talking to Dr. Naughton when we come back. So stick around. It's going to be a really great conversation. This is The Uncommon Good, and we're going to be back with Dr. Naughton right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this Wednesday on Iowa Catholic Radio. We want to thank everyone, like we said last week, who gave to the Carathon. We appreciate it very much. We can't tell you how thankful we are for you supporting our ministry. Again, if you just want to go into the text line, 515-223-1150, or if you'd like to go online, iowacatholicradio.com. If you happen to not be able to make your donation last week, of course, we thank you for supporting our work. Let's go to the guest today. Bud, like I said, since you were able to get in touch with them first, I'm going to let you introduce who we're talking to today.
So we're really honored to have on the show Dr. Michael Naughton. He's the director of the Center for Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota, and holds the co-chair in Catholic Studies, full professor in that department. He's taught at the College of Business for over 20 years and has also served as the chair of the board for Real Precision Manufacturing. He's the co-author and author of over 10 books and 50 articles. His most recent publication is called Getting Work Right, Labor and Leisure in a Fragmented World. Dr. Naughton, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, Bud, it's a great pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for that little snafu. I think I gave our producer the wrong number, so I'm glad we got a hold of you. Good. Been plowing through your book this week, and I think a great place to start, Dr. Naughton, is, I guess, with the problem, so to speak. And you really dive in deep at the beginning of the book to this question of living a divided life, which seems to be a real pressing issue in our culture. Could you share with our listeners some of what you have in mind when you say so many of us, even Catholics, are walking through life in kind of a divided way?
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think it's a common problem, not just today, but obviously through history. You know, it's always it's a reminder for all of us that the devil is the great divider, and it will always find ways in which to do this in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways. And it was very interesting at the Second Vatican Council, in the document Gaudium et Spes, it says one of the greatest errors of our age is the split between our religious life and our professional and practical life. And so sometimes we find ourselves in this kind of life that we fall into a kind of compartmentalized form of living. So I have my faith over here, I have my work over here, I have my family over here, I have my volunteer life over here. And sometimes those things get kind of separated from each other, and that begins to cause a kind of a lack of integration. I'll give you one classic example that we find this, particularly in the corporate world, but also any organizational world. All of us will talk about the importance of balance. And there is something about balance that's true. But often we have a balance that I have, more work over here or less work over here, or more leisure over here and more work over here. And what we never quite get to is a kind of integration between our work and our faith. And so the key thing is not balance, because the balance often perpetuates a divided life. But what we really need to do is to start to see this from an incarnational, sacramental reality that God is at work. And so what does that mean, and what does that begin to look like?
So, Dr. Naughton, this is Bo Bonner. Wonderful to have you on the show. And Bud warned me that I'm going to agree with you way too much. And so, this is going to be a problem. I'm talking about balance, right? So I'm a Benedictine Oblate, and you will hear people... I'm trying to think of the word. I mean, I don't mean this in the cuss word way. They bastardize the concept of ora et labora and make it like, you just need a good balance with stuff. I love that you bring this up, that this is sort of missing the point entirely. Earlier today, I was on the morning show talking about John Paul II's letter, Laborem Exercens. And I think it's interesting that when people want to talk about integration, it's not so much about balance, it's about submitting the proper things to the higher orders that they need to be submitted to. And in that letter, he says the primacy of man over things has to guide all of our considerations about how labor works. And then he'll go into even talking about, right, that the principle of the priority of labor over capital. He gets into all these really wonderful distinctions like you're talking about, but then the proper order that they're in. Do you think that that's sometimes what leads us astray, is we kind of have this idea that balance has to do with sort of mean equity, right? Like it's sort of a math problem, instead of subordinating things in the proper hierarchies in our life of work and leisure.
Well, no, we do have a lot to agree upon. I think the way you've described it is absolutely beautiful, Bill. And two things there. One is your point about balance. Balance often, again, it's not a bad word, but it can be an overused word. And we're always trying to calculate, right? Balance is often a form of calculation. And so I think I can resolve my problems through the kind of proper balance. And what we need is not a resolve to something. We need a rescue, right? I mean, the fact is we will, by ourselves, screw it up. And this is why we need grace. And we need God to kind of enter into the equation. And what God will always attempt to do is to order these types of things. And so one of the problems that we run into, particularly in the social teachings, is that, I think the problem we tend to do is we often will take, for example, business. We'll look at business and we'll say profit is a bad thing. Profit is a necessary thing, but it has to be ordered, right? And we can go through this on everything that we talk about. We can talk about it in terms of sexuality, right? We can talk about it in terms of food. We can talk about it in terms of drink. The question is we have to order these things. And this, of course, is the virtue of wisdom, right? It's the proper ordering of things to what things should be. There's a higher end that's going to be ordering the lower ends. So again, balance doesn't get at that. We're kind of calculating things. And what we really need is this kind of ordering principle, which is pervasive throughout the whole tradition. Aquinas and the Summa Theologica, it's all about the question of the ordered life, not a balanced life.
See, and I'm going to hit the same encyclical letter again. One of the most interesting things, I don't know how much of the listener knows sort of the background of this. There's this real way in which people will pit what John Paul II says about labor and leisure against someone like Leo XIII. And if you actually read the letters, it makes absolutely no sense to do this. But to your point about having a proper understanding, like you said, about what we're even talking about, John Paul II will say, all capital really is, it's not this... it's not the sort of prize that you get for winning an economic contest. It's really just the sort of historical manifestation of prior human labor. And what he means by that is anything that we're going to talk about, which is the means of production or infrastructure or any of the things that we imagine people owning, were created and made by human effort. And so the question doesn't start to be like that all capital is quote unquote bad, but it's certainly the case that if you think of capital in materialistic ways, and he right out says, if you think of it in terms of laissez-faire capitalism or Marxism, that you're misunderstanding how what human endeavor and ingenuity and the sort of ability for humans throughout time to work off the back of giants, that we all miss this. And that's just talking about in the labor field. It's certainly the case in leisure. Many of the problems with the entertainment industry is we all think that we've sort of like worked for the weekend, and so as individuals we need to expend entertainment energy instead of realizing that leisure is this process that's thousands of years in the making. And when you get to take time off, say on Labor Day, and worship or pray or read or recollect or recreate, you're actually joining a community of human leisure rather than just doing it yourself. And so I think that you pointing that out, it's really important, especially for young people to hear this who never get this reinforced in their life.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, Bill. Two quick points on this. One is your point about laborum exercens. Actually, I read that when it came out in 1991, and it actually was the thing that I never saw myself as an academic. I was teaching high school, and it was reading that document that actually put me on this trajectory of seeing the importance of work and a theology of work, because it's really and a philosophy of work. We tend to be kind of technicians with work, but what we really need, and what the church is calling us to do, is to really kind of ground ourselves into this theology of work, a philosophy of work. What John Paul, actually in that encyclical Laborum Exercens, the last chapter, he coins, and he's one of the first to coin it. It was back in the early 80s, a spirituality of work. So I think that is such an important document. If you read anything in that document, by the way, reading that last chapter, I think, is a nice way to, as almost as an entry point. It's chapter 5. And the second point that you were trying to get at is, and it's the thesis of my book, right? In order for us to get work right, we got to get leisure right. And so that becomes the other big question. And we tend to look at our leisure as escape, right? As amusement. And by the way, it's very interesting. The etymology of the word amuse, it comes from the word muses, which is the goddesses of the liberal arts, which are meant to refresh us. And when we put the word in front of amusement, it negates it. It negates it. And thus, if you look at the dictionary, it's very interesting. Look at the dictionary on amusement, particularly in Wiktionary. I think it says to stare stupidly at something, right? And so our form of amusement has become these kind of escapes. And we seem to, we work hard and now we need to escape. And again, this is a recipe for a life that is going to end not well, because you're not utilizing God's full capacity about how leisure and work need to inform each other and to interpenetrate each other, which then begins to look at a life of unity rather than a life of separation.
Dr. Naughton, I really appreciated the fact that your book begins with sacred scripture, and you demonstrate that some of our ideas about all of these matters go back to the creation accounts in Genesis.
Yes.
And that's fascinating, because for me, I meet a lot of Catholics who say, like, well, why do we seem to have two accounts in Genesis? So the kind of discussion that you have of Adam 1 versus Adam 2 was really fascinating to me. I think embedded in that whole narrative in the scripture is this question about what is the fundamental nature of work. And I've actually been in circles of Catholics where disagreement has broken out on this question. And I'm curious for you, how do you kind of exegete or understand in Scripture God giving the human beings work? Because I've seen some who have kind of interpreted it as like work is a punishment only after sin, and so it's almost like a form of penance for us. And I've seen others who say, no, you see Adam engaged in labor or in a kind of like co-creative activity from the very beginning.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, and it is interesting we do have these kind of debates over this, largely because a lot of people have such bad work, they can only think of it in terms of the fall. And to be quite frank, sometimes that might be a personal problem, that they're dealing with their own internal vices. But let's also be very honest. Some work is structured so inhumanely and so poorly, that the only seemingly good thing that can come out of it is money. But that's again part of the fall. But you're exactly right. God created us to work, and He created us to rest. I mean, all you have to do is look at the Genesis account, and because that's we if you think about work, you think about it in terms of activity, right? Our development comes often through this ability to act in the world. Now, the question, of course, is how we're going to act, and do we have conditions in the workplace that help us to act in ways that's drawing upon the gifts of what God has given to us? Because each of us has been endowed with a set of gifts. And again, the Genesis account has this kind of creative, thrust that God is creating the world, and what makes humanity, when He creates humanity, that is the continuation. He tells us to fill the earth, to be fruitful, right, to subdue it, to have dominion. But in the fall, we distort it, right? The same thing, we distort sexuality. It's the same kind of reality. We're sexual beings. We're made for these things. And yet the fall distorts these realities, and thus we often then fall back on terms of a negative reality to it. But again, going back to what Bud was getting at, it's about the ordering of life. Again, it's really hard to look at. And again, if one looks at Judaism and Christianity, we have this great, very positive view of labor, of manual labor, unlike the Greeks, who saw manual labor as very negative, and thus that's why they were based on an economy of slavery. But if you look at the Jewish and the Christian view, we've always had a much positive view of what human labor should be about.
Now, this is a great point, and I'm going to be a horrible person and name drop something I wrote. So I wrote an article on Notre Dame's Church Life Journal called The Horror Inherent in Leisure. I was talking about Joseph Pieper, who is one of my favorites of all time. And to sum it up, what I was trying to get at is that we probably need to be, when it comes to work, we need to learn to love it more and not see it so punitively. And that when we do that, we might actually see work as more social and trying to help the plight of workers and things like this. But my article was like, we probably all need to work harder at leisure, right? Which is a paradox, seemingly. And I talk about coming from a working class family who, when you tell them about leisure and how it comes off to them, it's like, oh, well, Bo wants to professionally never do anything hard in his life, right? Like, Bo wants to become an academic so he can slack off. And I have to admit, right, academia has really done that to itself. You look a lot at what we do, and it seems like we don't do anything. But I think it's precisely because of what you said. If even academic and contemplative pursuits start to look just like stupefying gaze, right? Like you're saying, like a muse, right? To something to kill time. We forget that we have to work hard at some of the most leisurely things we do. You have to work at prayer. You get better at worship if you put in effort. It's just like playing a sport or a game. Like the way to even enjoy yourself takes effort. So it's almost like we need to learn to try to make work less punitive and try harder and put forth more effort when it comes to leisure. And I think that's kind of the world we're stuck in.
No, I think that's good advice. I mean, everyone's going to be, it's the paradox of it. And you mentioned Joseph Pieper, and Pieper, when I teach a course on faith and work, particularly directed toward the business students at my university, University of St. Thomas, in our Catholic Studies program. And that I use Pieper's book. It's the first book they read, because Pieper is the one who's going to provide for you he provides the paradigm shift about how we begin to understand what leisure is about. And while I would agree with you, there's a sense that we have to work harder at it. It's not we have to work harder at it to put ourselves predisposed to it, which then, and he defines it in the book, right, that leisure is this condition of the soul to receive the reality of the world. And that is sometimes the hardest thing, particularly for us Americans, who's always about trying to get things done, right? But it's a receptive attitude. And that's why silence is so important. As Pieper says, if we don't regain silence, our hectic amusements will kill us. And so how do you build in the silence that then leads us to prayer, that then builds up our faith? But it's not so much that I have to control it. I have to receive it. I met Mother Teresa twice in my life, and once was in Calcutta, India. And she has this, when she's leaving you, she says, I have my business card to give you. And it's a beautiful business card. There's no phone number or email, but it says the fruit of silence is prayer, right? So do I put myself in this place of receptivity, right? And the key thing is, how do I silence this mind of mine, which is always like a drunken monkey, it's going all over the place.
Right.
And I have to learn that discipline of silence. And as you say, that sometimes takes a lot of work, right? That I just stop. And in that will come prayer. And then that's where Lectio Divina comes in, right? Where the Word of God starts to wash over us. And then we start to see things that we've never seen before. And it's not because of my effort, but I'm allowing God's grace to enter, right? And that, I think, is getting at the heart of leisure. And once you're at that, then when you go to work, you start to see work in a different way because you're seeing it the way God sees it, not the way that we see it.
Yeah, we've had students do an assignment where they have to be quiet with no phone for 30 minutes, and the sort of stress and anxiety that doing nothing can cause someone is amazing. We're coming up on the break. This has been a fantastic conversation so far, Dr. Naughton. We look forward we'll come back after the break, and we'll get right back into it because, like I said, there's so much to agree on, so much to bring up on this Labor Day week. So thank you for being with us, and we'll be back with the Uncommon Good right after these messages. Back with the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Budmar coming to you live here on this beautiful Wednesday. We have Dr. Michael Naughton, whose book, Getting Work Right, Labor and Leisure in a Fragmented World, is, I just have to say, a wonderful introduction to the work he's done, and he's done quite a bit of it. He's over at the University of St. Thomas. They have a page that actually has quite a few links to other work he's done if you're interested. That would be the book that I would say to start with, Getting Work Right. Dr. Naughton, thank you for joining us back on the show.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.
So, also, I've noticed that you're on I think you're in a magazine that we were both, Bud and I, and you were all on the same issue. It was the health one. The Health Progress, December 2016. I think we might have been in the same magazine, so that would have been weird.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Sure.
We feel really a lot more honored than you are, I'm sure.
No. I'm enjoying the conversation. Thank you.
So we left off the last 30 minutes talking about the work it takes to do leisure. There's a wonderful author out there named Matthew Crawford who has a book talked about the world outside of your head. He wrote an article that said the most scarce resource in the modern world is attention because we have marketing, we have TVs, we have screens. It's hard to put forth the effort to have silence, to have the leisure that makes this possible. But I'd also say that it's probably the same thing that works back against us in the economic world, too, is if you're that busy and you don't have time to enjoy the silence, to have the prayer that prayer is the fruit of silence, you start getting into the cycle where you start misunderstanding what the end and good of work is. And it's like you said, some of us have jobs that are so brutal and mismanaged that money is the only good thing that can seem to come through from them. But even some of us that have jobs in air conditioning and jobs where we actually are using our skills that we train for, if we don't take that time in our life, the leisure aspect, we start to undermine the goods even of doing work. Towards the end of your book, it sounds like that's what you're wanting us to really think about, is the good itself. What is the good in all of these different parts of our life that we need to integrate? And I guess my question after that long rant is to say, in the sort of courses that you've taught, especially in the business side of the college, is that almost just alien language for students to hear you saying, if we're going to talk about business, we have to talk about the goods inherent in that life and that world?
Yeah, actually, I don't. I think actually they like the language.
Good.
Yeah, because I think it's a different kind of language. One of the things I've tried to stay away from, and I'm not saying this is not a bad language, but I find the language of values just too abstract. And it's it's in the tradition, you'll see it in certain places, but I find the language of goods something a little bit more concrete. And what people want to do is that they want to contribute to the good. They want that their work is making things better, and so the articulation of the goods in that language I find to be much more helpful. So in the book, and it's also there's a document that came out of the Vatican called The Vocation of the Business Leader, which I was coordinator of, and I helped kind of put that together as well for the Vatican. We talk about three goods of business, or quite frank, three goods of any organization: good goods, good work, and good wealth, right? And the idea of good goods is what am I producing? What goods and services am I producing? And I will say I do have students in my classes who say, well, whatever the market gives, whatever the market bears, whether it's pornography or malt liquor or cigarettes or whatever. And we say, well, really, is that, well, that's what the market does, and if it's legal, it's fine. But then when I often say to them, I says, well, would you do that? And some of them say, well, yeah, depending on the price. And then I say to them, but are you worthy of it? And I got to tell you, that stops them. Is this worthy of you? And what we want to do is we want to create a better life for people. And we're made to give to others, right? It's inherent. That's when we're at our best. But the problem is that sometimes work just wears that down. But then I say to them, I said, but you can also do this, and I'm on the board of a manufacturing company here in the Twin Cities. And, it's a what they call a torque technology. In one sense, we make hinges. Well, you know what? You need hinges in a society. We used to make hinges for laptop computers, and you don't want your laptop falling down. So it's just not that we need people in healthcare or people in teaching or social work. We need people in all sorts of different areas, and that making hinges and screws and carpets and paints and all these types of things are really important to make a better society. And when people start thinking this way, they go, yeah, that makes sense. So I think the language of the goods is a language of the church, to be quite frank with you, but it's also a language that the world needs today.
Yeah, and then following that section of the book, Dr. Naughton, you get into the question of good wealth, and I find this one a really difficult one to tease out. And I know, I guess speaking stereotypically, I know you probably have a lot of, or maybe a few alternative stories where you've seen this done well. But in our minds, when we think of the CEO or the CFO of a company entering into a room with shareholders of the company, the bottom line or the primary concern is how much profit have we produced during this time period. But you show in the book, right, that the question of wealth has to go beyond merely just the sheer numbers, right? So what does good wealth look like, or how do we distinguish that from less good wealth?
Well, one of the things you're raising here, and it's a much bigger question that we could probably deal with in this short time that we have together, but it's the whole question of ownership, right? And ownership will always, if you have owners who are simply about maximizing shareholder wealth or maximizing profit, and that's the only driver, or that's the main driver, you're going to have a hard time, But not all owners are like that. And so the question, let's put that out there, and it is an issue, and you have to deal with it. But good wealth is really, we know that what any organization has to do is they have to create more than what's been given to them. We call that margin. We call that profit. Whatever it might be, whether for-profit or not-for-profit, if you don't have more than what's been given to you, you die, right? And that's in the for-profit world or the not-for-profit world. But and that's often what we might call creating wealth. But then what you also have to do is that when you create wealth, you have to distribute wealth, because there are all sorts of stakeholders who are involved in the creating of that wealth. And as a leader of an organization, you have this kind of obligation out of justice to treat your suppliers well, to treat your customers well, to treat your employees well, right? And to treat your shareholders well, but to treat them all fairly and justly. And this is why the church has always been concerned about questions like just prices, just wages, right? Also, how long do you take to pay back your suppliers, things of that sort. And so it's that dynamism between wealth creation and wealth distribution. And to be quite frank, there's tensions there, because sometimes you don't make enough wealth, and then you're finding it hard to be just to others. But that's part of the tensions and the problems that you're dealing with. So I think that dynamism of good wealth is in the relationship between the creation of wealth and the distribution of wealth.
Well, you say like the ownership question, it's much larger than we have to deal with. I think one other thing that we probably don't have enough time, but we can only hint at, is how people can strip screws, right? So like if you strip the thread of a screw, it can no longer stay in place, and all the screw's going to do is just spin and spin and spin. Well, I think we've done that with a lot of our sort of language about economics, where if anybody talks about making a profit, we're going to call them robber barons. And if anyone's going to say, oh, what about the social responsibility of corporations, people are going to accuse them of being communists, right? What the Catholic Church hopes to do, and I go back again to the encyclical letter by John Paul II, it's not just that we're saying that there's a middle way or a third way, it's actually saying we're just talking about it incorrectly. So when you talk about something like the universal destination of goods and Catholic social teaching, and you say things that like ownership is not absolute, right? Like that we don't have a sort of, from John Locke on, understanding in the church that, if you sort of put your labor into something, it's yours absolutely. We are a communal creature. We belong to each other. And so on the one hand, we have to be honest about what we're hoping our work in the world does, that it adds to it, that it perpetuates this long handing on of prior human work to the next generation. But then in doing that, we do that in league with so many other people. The only thing, the sort of practical example that I've thrown out, and you probably have better ones, is I start to say, hey, look, everyone who works at a big corporation, for instance, uses roads, right? And roads, as anybody who lived in Oklahoma, like I'm from, roads fall apart really fast. And if people don't feel like they have a responsibility, and by people I mean the corporations that have their workers use those roads, if people don't feel something that incarnational and specific, right, that like we owe each other to try to make it where we can use these roads together, that's not socialist, that's not laissez-faire capitalism. That's talking about incarnational reality on the ground. Do we care enough about each other to make this common life work? And I think that starts to be the difficulty, is making people realize that common life is not just an abstraction, but has actual on-the-ground ramifications.
No, you're exactly right, and I love your metaphor of stripped screw, right? And that often our language will do this. Either on one side, we tend to depend upon the market, and we think everything's about the market and it's about profit. Or on the other hand, we tend to simply focus on the state, and we just see it as the state as the only actor who's going to kind of to solve the problems. And what the church is appointing, as you're exactly right, it's trying to give us categories that come out of the culture. And the culture is going to be has a kind of language that is both moral and spiritual. And often the language that we fall into is either, kind of market-oriented, or it's simply regulatory-oriented. And neither of those are going to really solve the problem. They're not going to give us the deeper insights about how we should behave and what we should be doing in there. Because to be quite frank, they eliminate some of the key categories that make us distinctly human, such as sacrifice, such as the gift. And Pope Benedict has this great line where he talks about the importance of the logic of the gift. And we often don't come to, questions of our work. We come to it with the logic of the market or the logic of the contract. And we've just eliminated this idea of the logic of the gift, which is just going to give us a whole different perspective about how we start to look at these things.
As we've been talking, I've been thinking one avenue for evangelization in our time is specifically with what the church has to say about marriage and family in relation to these questions. I get the sense sometimes when I'm talking to non-Christian friends that they may be open to what the church has to say about labor, but when we talk about marriage and family life, I feel like we're moving to a place culturally where a lot of people think, well, that's sort of like a Catholic, that's a religious belief that they hold, and so they can kind of hold that as part of their private religious practice, but it doesn't or shouldn't have a bearing on how we organize our communal life. And Dr. Naughton, I think your book shows that the question of family is so essential to this whole topic. It can't be abstracted out from the rest of the Church's Catholic social teaching, because faith and family really, as you say, they're institutions that limit economic activity so that there's a natural space for people to foster right relationships with one another and with God. So could you expound upon, I feel like what the church says about labor just can't be separated from all that it affirms about family and marriage life.
No, you're absolutely right. And what I say in the book is that the primary institutions of human society are largely these cultural institutions, and they are family and church, right? Because that's where our deepest identity comes from. My deepest identity doesn't come from my work, right? As I often say, we have a competition with the university, or St. John's University up the road. I said to my students, if I left St. Thomas to go to St. John's, it may not be a good decision, but you wouldn't call me, immoral for it, right? But if I left my wife for another woman, you say, you creep,
You're a scoundrel. Yeah.
You scoundrel, right? Because why? There's something deep. And by the way, the other thing is I have dual citizenship. I'm a citizen of the United States, and I'm also a citizen of Ireland, right? But if I said to you, well, I'm Catholic and I'm Muslim, you say, no, you sound like you're confused. You can be one or the other, right?
Yeah.
There's something there, because there's something in these areas that are deepest identity. Now, the question for us, though, is that deepest identity needs to influence and form as we move into this realm of work, right? Instead of being compartmentalized, it should inform us. And thus, when I go into work, my secretary and my colleagues, they're not my brothers and sisters, they're not my wife, they're not these things, but I should treat them like my brothers and sisters, right? Those relationships in the family are forming some of the deepest bonds, and they should begin to inform that humanity needs to be found wherever I go. And so I try to start treating people in different kinds of ways. And if you shortchange that family, you're not going to get it from work by itself. So that relationship, I think that relationship is so critical that you bring up.
Yeah, and we're getting to the end of the show, but what this makes me think of is the sort of, Christ is the stumbling block, right, that is foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling block to the Jews. I think in social teaching, the just wage is, in the Catholic conception, is what makes everyone mad, and appropriately so, right? Because if you're talking about only market-based solutions, like you're saying, the question starts to be, what would the market bear, or, what is the sort of bottom line, all of these questions like this. But then oftentimes when you get into the maybe more socialist or sort of, Marxist sort of, when they're talking about wages, they leave out the family. But I go back one more time to sort of finish up the show, that John Paul II letter that I was talking about. He says, look, a just wage is a way in which one person working in a family can sustain a family so that the other person can take care of the home, and that person who's working has enough time and stability to be in the family. And, of course, we can say that's an ideal, and what does that all mean, and that changes throughout time. But to your point, it's the language of it all that what we start to say is because of the family, we have to think about wages different than either side of this, stripped screw way of talking about economics. We have like 2 minutes, but I throw that out to you to sort of put a cap on this wonderful conversation, if you don't mind.
I'll do it very quickly. And again, Joseph Pieper has this beautiful description of this whole question of a just wage in his book. But at the heart of it is this, right? A wage is about a human relationship between an employer and an employee. And thus the criteria, the principles that guide it is, one, it's often their full-time work. It should be about need. It should be about what they contribute. And it also should be sustainable. Right? If I pay a living wage and an equitable wage, and I go out of business, that's not a just wage; it's a stupid wage, right? And what the question is, those three are in tension with it. But that if I'm working with an employee, I have an obligation to that to make sure that their needs are being fulfilled. Now, it's not always easy, and it depends on their skill level. It depends on the market. But I have this obligation, and the question is, how do I do it in such a way that I can still, in a sense, create a profitable business in the process? Not always easy, but one, as always one says, one's vocation is never easy.
That's right. And as an Oklahoman, I always like to throw in the element of the tragic and pessimistic. Like, wouldn't it be great if a business closed because it was trying too hard to be good to its workers rather than some other horrible scandal or something else? Dr. Naughton, it's been a fantastic show. It truly is one of the times that I think we could go on for another complete hour and have more things to bring up. Fascinating topic. So honored that you're on the show. Dr. Michael Naughton, like I said, holder of the Koch Endowed Chair in Catholic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. There is so much that you can go online and find that he's written. It's all wonderful, but really I want to promote the book as an introduction to it. Getting Work Right, Labor and Leisure in a Fragmented World. Dr. Michael J. Naughton, thank you so much for coming on the show, and who knows, maybe we can have you back. We appreciate it so much.
I would look forward to it. It's a pleasure meeting you over the phone, and please give Bishop Pates my regards.
All right.
Yeah, we will do. God bless
Thank
and
you.
safe travels.
All right. God bless you now. Take care.
Bud, I don't always praise you with your C pluses with fantasy football, but you might not be able to choose quarterbacks well, but you sure as heck found a good interview. So good job, buddy. That was fantastic.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it was one of those interviews where I was taking notes for myself, so it was great to have him on.
So, this The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, in our cities, in our families, our state, the whole nation, the entire world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we will be joining you back next week, next Wednesday. Thanks, folks.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.